Hi, I'm Karen McTavish. Thanks for watching the DVD on Freehand Victorian feathers. When I started quilting in 1997, I was marking all my designs, all my feathers. It took forever to quilt a quilt. I met Diane Godzinski at a quilt show, and she gave me the confidence to start quilting just using the stem as my guide. And she said, you don't have to mark all those feathers. And I came home, developed a technique that we can apply towards the long arm or a domestic machine. And I'm here to share that with you. So let's get started. It's really helpful to draw things out before you actually start quilting. It's pretty scary just to start quilting without a lot of practice beforehand. So we're gonna pretend this is a paper and pencil, and we're drawing on the beginning of a triangle. This is a great block to start when you're actually doing quilting feathers for the first time. So we're gonna start with this triangle, and we're gonna start the way we write our name, which is going that way. Right? So every time you start, you want your feathers to go that way. So we're going to start here, and we're going to start with a purl, and it's going to head up towards the highest peak. So we'll start with a purl, and we're going to backtrack over our start and stop, so we secure our stops and starts, and then it's bump, bump, back, over. And you see how I sort of leave a little room on the side, not going to hit that seam, but I want to come really far back, get to the highest peak, and then backtrack to the next feather. See, we're not even at that halfway point yet. We're still coming back, and we're going to lay our feathers down as we go. So bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, and then there's that little one right there. So that's basically how it works. We're going to start here. This is the flying geese. This works on all these blocks, these feathers. We start where the way we write our name, it heads up towards the highest peak. Bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over. Now we have to decide, do we want our feathers here or here? Remember, our needle's down, so we would probably sneak over here. Start with the purl, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, sneak down. This direction feels a lot more comfortable. Bump, bump, back, over. See how we're still almost back to the beginning? That's the key. Now you lay them down. They should not go up and down. They should be laying down. Now, I like to stitch in the ditch, and I do it this way. And this is ditch quilted, and then you can come up and over. Now the whole thing is stabilized. Now I want to do feathers in here, so I might do bump, bump, back, over. Of course, it's going to look a lot better on the quilt than it does here. Drawing, for some reason, just feels a little bit more sloppy, and on the quilt it looks a lot better. Now, the opposite way, the mirror image, would look better, so I actually could tie off and start back down here, so we get the mirror image. And it might be overkill to do this entire thing in feathers, but I just want you to see exactly how each feather would look if they had mirror images. You know, and you could just do straight line in here instead of having a feather in there. A lot of the piecing you'll see is these sawtooths, and the sawtooths are almost like paper pieced on a curve. So I want you to consider maybe doing a straight line type of design up in the sawtooth. And then what we could do is feather in the background. So it's very similar to this style, and we go purl, and then they're all going to go the same direction, and then sneak down the ditch, try to get in the ditch. This is a purl, very fast, and I know you're thinking, well, should each feather be even number of feathers? You know, I don't think so. I think you need to give yourself a break and not really focus on that. It's really about the overall impact of the quilt, not really about do we have an equal amount of feathers in every single segment. sneak down, purl, bump, bump, back, over. Sneak down, bump, bump, back, over. And then what we're going to do is we're going to show you on the practice sample on a piece of white fabric how to do this so you're really clear on all the registration lines. So now we're going to move into the square. The square is just as easy as the triangle. We have a lot of squares in quilting, so we have to learn how to take our purple air erasable pen, make an X, or our chalk pencil and make an X. These registration lines have to be in there, no matter what angle the block is turned. So let's just start with the easiest design, which is a half square triangle. And we want to go the way we write our name, and we want to start with the lowest one, the one closest to our belly. So we'll start with that purl, and we're going to keep our feathers a little bit, maybe a 1/4 inch away from our registration lines. So we're sort of done with that portion. Now we lay them down. And that bump, bump, back, over. You don't have to do the bump, bump, back, over method if you don't want to. Some people backtrack through every feather. A lot of domestic machine quilters backtrack all the way through every feather. It's totally up to you. This is just the way I do it. Bump, bump, back, over. And it just means less thread buildup, less quilting. It gives the feathers a little bit of a hand quilted look. So bump, bump, back, over. If you are quilting on domestic, remember you can keep turning your quilt, so you don't have to learn how to do it on the side like this. And then those registration lines, you would just remove them when you're done. And now we're done. And of course, I like to stitch in the ditch before I start quilting. So for example, on this square, I stitch in the ditch. And I usually start here, stitch in the ditch, and then do my purl. I just take off. And my stop and start would be sort of light. It wouldn't be really intense because I'll be traveling over that stop and start several times. So bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over. Us long armers need to learn how to do this upside down, off to the side. Again, if you're a domestic machine quilter, you just have to turn your quilt. This is an on-point block, and I'm just going to start here and make my stitch in the ditch, stabilizing that, and then I have to start the way I write my name. If you start doing your feathers and it feels like you're backing up a truck in the dark in a garage, it probably doesn't feel very good. So that means you're going the wrong direction. We usually can write our name a certain way. When you feel like you're doing things backwards, then you know you're going the wrong direction. So that for me was going counterclockwise, but it's the way I write my name, so it still felt good. So this is the square. And then these registration marks just come out with by removing them with a damp sponge, or you can let air remove them. So now we're going to demonstrate how to draw on a double wedding ring. So this is the melon and this is the block, and later in the video you can see me actually quilting a double wedding ring. These are registration lines, so you have to have a registration line in the middle of the melon or in the middle of the block, and these are air erasable marking tool or a chalk. We're going to start with the melon, and we're going to do the number 8 right in the middle. We're not going to measure, we're just going to hope for the best that we put the number 8 in the middle of the melon. So then we have to get rid of our stop and start, and then we hit one side at a time, and it goes bump, bump, back, over. Our feathers follow the registration line. We're going to leave this end open, come back and do the other side, bump, bump, back, over, and you create a stem as you go, leaving the end open. Now we're going to complete the melon. And at the very end, we're going to add a little purl. Bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over. And at the very end, you end with a purl. And then you just stop and start. Same thing over here with the number 8. Sometimes I will put in a little registration line. So it's a big plus sign and a big X. This keeps me from having, so all my plumes are nice and even. So the number 8, and then before you tie off, the number 8 again. So it's a little 4-leaf clover. All right, so pick a side, any side, and then stay within your registration lines. Giving some distance by the, whoop, you don't want to go into the piecing like that. Giving this a little area here unquilted, and then you go to the other side. It should look like a plume. And then end with a pearl. Same thing, just like your melon. And this shape is very similar to the triangle. See how it heads up and then it comes down? Leave the end open, come back, creating a stem. And I'm not the greatest hand drawer in the world, but they do look better on the quilt than they do on the whiteboard. Leave that end. And then end in a pearl, scooch back, get to the other side. So we have one more plume to do, and then we're done. I think the average it took me to get through one quilt block on a double wedding ring was about 8 minutes, because I timed myself. And then end in a pearl. And that's how we handle the double wedding ring. Just a side note, all these are stabilized, and you can do like a continuous curve type of thing, but I like to do a little I feel like that one is, the continuous curve is predictable. So what I like to do, especially with modern fabrics, is I like to go a 1/4 inch away from the seam. So if this was my seam, normally you would just think I would stitch in the ditch right in that seam. But I don't want to be predictable. So the nice thing about this is our seam isn't stitched in the ditch, and that's what you'll see on the next video, but when you're touching it, the seam actually comes up like that, and it just feels really good. So that's what we're doing on our next segment. Anytime I'm using a feather wreath with a circle, I always use a stencil, a pre-made stencil that you can purchase. The reason why we don't do freehand circles is they kind of get lopsided and they don't look like a circle. So whenever I'm doing a freehand feather, I'm always doing a wreath that's already made with a stencil. They just don't come out very well if you just wing it. So anytime you see a circle wreath, that is a stencil. Now that you've practiced on paper and you've got the bump back over down and you have your feathers, the angle of the feathers, you've got that under your belt. Now we're going to move on to actually quilting on a piece of fabric. It's critical to learn how to stitch in the ditch using ruler work. You can use a long ruler or a short ruler as long as you have a quilting foot that has a high enough fence so you don't accidentally hit your ruler. There's a little bit of a danger factor when you're using rulers. You could hit your ruler if you don't have a nice wide grip on it. The reason why we stitch in the ditch before we add our feathers is basically it creates a boundary, and that line you won't cross over it. It creates sort of a barrier. And so it's important to learn that stitching in the ditch is done first before we move on and start doing our feathers. So the first thing you want to do is stitch in the ditch. And sometimes I use even nylon thread, clear nylon thread, so I have invisible ditch work. And then I can start doing my feathers in a regular colored thread. And you could just take off from there. You can also use your ditches to escape and get to the next block so you don't have to tie off. The easiest feather to start with is in a flying geese or a triangle, and that's why we started with that flying geese. The next thing is the square. So basically it's 4 half square triangles, right? So when you're long arming, the first thing you want to do is
learn how to quilt the block in front of you, but also on the sides and upside down. And that takes some practice, but you can certainly quilt the square by drawing out some registration lines right down the middle, like a big X, and then practice doing feathers going counterclockwise. So you can practice it doing on the sides, and you can practice it doing upside down. If you're a domestic machine quilter, you just turn the quilt and you do the same thing on every single triangle. But here we're just gonna have you practice in a simple triangle, because you could turn that into a square. So for example, on a Irish chain, you have the plain block and then the piecing. You could just practice this design over and over and over, and you can become an expert at it. And then you're ready to move on to the, drunkard's path block and the more advanced double wedding ring. And so it's easiest to start in the simple triangle to get going.
So now let's apply what we've learned to a real life quilt. So this is an applique quilt we're gonna work on next, and we're going to incorporate feathers throughout. So we're gonna start with a really easy block. It's just a block that has been separated into 4 triangles with a registration line. In this case, they'll be pieced. Then we're gonna move on to a border, and the border gets a little bit more challenging. And then we're gonna put feathers in a medallion, an applique medallion. And we're gonna show you how to do that. So it's sort of like a simple, easy to a little bit more advanced. Okay, we're gonna do this block using the Victorian feathers, and we're gonna start at the lowest triangle and work our way around going counterclockwise. We are going to be in non-stitch regulated mode because our feathers will have a prettier arc. We are using a pink thread so you can see. If you'd like to use a ruler to keep you in control of that block, sometimes it's helpful to use a ruler. I'm not going to use a ruler and just hope that I have my feathers heading up towards the highest point and then coming back right on that ditch. So we'll start with the first purl. And notice it's going the way we write our name, heading up towards the highest peak. Bump, back, over, bump, back. See how far back we're going? We really like to have that nice arc, that beautiful curve. Now we're still, we're halfway done. We're almost at the beginning again. I want you to see how at this point our highest feather is in the tallest peak, so the rest of them are going to lay down flat. So this next block is an Irish chain, and the first thing we've done is we stitched in the ditch using a nylon thread, and we've gotten around all the little squares. The next thing we're going to show you is how to create these curved feathers. And this little space right here, this rectangle and this square, kind of a tough area to put feathers in. This is all free motion. You can take a purple air erasable pen and you can go ahead and mark your curves, but we're going to go free motion Victorian feathers and not do any marking. Okay, so this block has been stitched in the ditch with a nylon thread. We switched our nylon thread to a Quilting glide thread, and it's matching yellow. And we're just going to guesstimate here where our center is, and we're going to make that curve. So it's just a nice little curve like that. And now we're going to go back to the middle. And I've got this big GoPro, so I'm going to guess. This camera's in my way, so I'm just going to guess where these lines are. Backtrack down, make a purl. And I basically do feathers on both sides. Sneak back over. And then go right into that ditch, go back up to that corner. Guesstimate that center, backtrack down to the middle, make a purl. And we're going to sneak over to the other side. Sneak down. And I have this big camera in the way, so normally you would want to nail your backtrack. I didn't quite nail it. And then you're done. Now, if you can't live with that, you need to pick it out or re-quilt. So now we're going to move on to this border, and some of the tricks that we're going to use to add feather throughout this border is we're going to use clear thread to go over all the applique with nylon thread. It's clear, so if you go outside of it a little bit or inside of it, it's not going to really matter. We are going to use a disappearing ink pen, which is a purple air erasable pen. Disappears in 24 hours. I don't want you to overthink this too much, but you might take the tip of the leaf and maybe draw a scroll. So this would be the leaf center or stem of a feathered scroll. So that's enough little area here for one little feather. And so I'm just going to start, and this purple marking will go away. I'm just going to start, if you look over here, I think this is a nice space to add a feather. So I'm going to take my white thread and bring up my off-white bobbin. And I'm going to start with a purl, and I'm going to work off of the side of this, this stem, this applique stem. And we're going to start with a purl, and here we go. We're going to bring our feathers up to the applique flower. And slowly build it around the flower, reaching back. And I might just shorten them up. So I just finished this stem, and now I'm going to take off from this feather. I'm going to get to the side of a feather. I'm going to just clip this little clip. There we go. And now I'm going to head up to this scroll. Start with another purl. And I'm going to get higher and higher and higher until I pretty much reach that flower. Now I'm going to shorten them up because I do want to do this scroll. They gradually get shorter. Now I'm going to finish out my scroll. Remember, However, it sort of looks like trapunto, doesn't it? This batting is actually 2 layers of batting. We have a silk and a wool. And that gives it that beautiful sculpture. So we backtracked and we're going to finish this scroll. Center feathers. Now we're going to backtrack again, get to the tip, and we do the other side. And it would be nice if we could do this whole section. So I'm going to take my ruler here, and I'm going to backtrack a little. And we're going to start right here and work our way around that scroll. Stretch it out to right where my finger is here. And this is what we call the rooster tail, where we kind of whip around that rooster tail around the scroll. And now we're done. And then we tie off. And then we move on to the next section. And if you'd like to get that instant gratification, what you can do is just erase out that purple pen with an eraser pen. It'll just come out in time too. Now we're going to do the other side of this really pretty applique, and we're going to gradually have our feathers come up. And if you notice right here, you can see I've kind of drawn out a line, a purple air erasable line. That's sort of where my batting is. It's sort of a cheat sheet. I don't want my feather tips to go right to the very edge of my quilt. That's where the binding's going to go. So I like to keep my feathers around that binding. So you never have the feather tips appearing in the binding. So drawing out that line is really helpful. I'm going to start with a pearl. I gradually build them higher and higher. So now we're going to lay out some feather designs in this applique, and the way the applique is centered in the medallion is sort of shooting out across it. So we're just going to use our purple air erasable pen. We're going to draw some scrolls, and I think it would be nice if we had a few, like maybe a grouping of 3. And so this one's going that way, that one's going this way, and this scroll is going to go the opposite way. And we're going to start by seeing that, you know, everything's been stitched in the ditch. So now we're just going to start with our white thread. We used nylon thread to stitch in the ditch. Now that that is stable, we're going to start quilting our feathers. So we're just going to follow the purple line. It's just a suggestion. Try to nail it if you can. If you don't nail that purple line, that's not the end of the world. Try to backtrack right on that quilted line and move on to the next. You can erase out those purple marks, but we're not gonna. We're gonna tie off and restart again where we started our stem. Because they're not marked, we cannot just instinctively know where to go. We have to start at this beginning again. And we'll start by doing the inside of the scroll first. And start with a pearl. And gradually build the feather going around the inside of the scroll. Using the bum back over method. Bringing those feathers in towards that last scroll. You can back out of it. Now you're going to see a V. And this V shape is where
out a middle purl so we can finish the other side. We didn't change directions. We just added that center purl in our V shape, and that gives us the ability to go around the other side. We can stretch this out high, and then gradually bring it down, leaving room on the other side for this little feather to come around. When I'm here, I don't want to backtrack again and have more thread buildup. What I'll do is sneak over here where I won't get caught to get to the other side. And now I shorten up my feathers again to get to this scroll. I get my inside scroll done first. Backtrack, and look, there's another V, and I add that center purl in there. And I love the way this double batting, this wool and this silk, really take on some sculpture and texture with the quilting. It's pretty unusual. You see two battings being used, and it's a great alternative to trapuntoed. You don't want to spend that time working on it. Battings. I'm going to sneak over again, and I'm going to get to this other side. Now that we've practiced our double wedding ring on paper and pencil and on the design board, let's show you what it looks like on a real quilt. We're going to start quilting in the melon. The first thing we do is we stitch in the ditch and we stabilize the melons. So I'm just going to show you how I use a curve. And we're using white thread. And I'm trying to get in that ditch the best I can while adjusting my ruler. Sort of adjust, so when I feel like the curve is going to change, I readjust my ruler. The little beep that you hear is basically telling me my stitch regulator is on. This is the quick curve ruler, which works really well on the other side. My hand is running into the GoPro, sorry about that. Stop, readjust. And how I quilted it is just basically going back, and I do a 1/4 inch away from the seam here. So I'm using my hopping foot as a guide, and I'm just quilting between the ditches. So I'm not actually quilting the ditch, I'm quilting between them. So it's a really nice texture design once it's quilted in. Feels really good. Stitch regulators on, and I use my straight edge to stitch right back over the ditch so I don't have to stop and restart. So that gives you an idea of how we're going to handle that. You could do continuous curve, and you could do all sorts of designs in that piecing. Now we're just going to bring up our bobbin, and we're going to start with our melon. Clip that off, and we're going to start right in the middle. And so if you look at this block, you can see that the middle is between here, these two pieces. You can draw yourself a line if you would like, but
I'm using my seam line. You see the seam is making a perfect straight line. So this seam is where we're gonna have this this stem. And so we're gonna start just like we did on the whiteboard with the number 8. We're gonna take it off stitch regulated mode and just be in manual mode. If you notice, I'm holding my top thread and my bobbin thread tight. All right. So you hit one side at a time. And I'm just going to stop here, needle down, snip my thread, because that's just going to make a big mess. That was my top, and now I have to bring up my bobbin. Okay. And now we're going to hit one side at a time. Make sure you have enough room here next to your piecing that it's not too crowded with feathers. I like to think about the size of a dime. Like the curves here are going to be about the size of, like, it's almost a completed circle. So my curves are going to be the size of a dime. And I'm going to leave the end open. And I'm just going to do my best to get to the other side. Size of a dime. Think about that. That feather shape is the size of a dime. And now I'm going to enclose it with a pearl. So now I'm going to cut all the way through. You can use a ruler if you'd like. But I don't always. I just go straight across. And you start here, and then you do the other side. So bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, and then leave the opening alone. So you'll add that pearl in later. Do the other side. Bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over. Okay, so now I'm just going to do that pearl, and we're done. So I might just like needle up and down, or I might jiggle, 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 secure that stitch, and then snip my bobbin. Alright, so we have our seam lines as a guide here. It's a big plus sign. Then I've added, with a purple eraser pen, I've added the big X. That's what we need to start off the double wedding ring. Very similar to the melon, we're going to add the number 8. And we're going to make sure that it ends up looking like a 4-leaf clover. Notice we're in non-stitch regulated mode. So this is our base for our Victorian feathers. So now we're going to start on this side, and it's going to end up looking like a plume. Same thing at the end, we're going to add a pearl in later. Bump, bump, back, over. Bump, bump, back, over. Come down the stem or the seam that's in there and do the other side. I like being in non-stitch regulated mode because I feel the drag of the stitch regulator, and it makes my feathers look a little boxy, squared up. So non-stitch regulated is probably better. Now we're going to end in a tall pearl. Come down again, and then we do the other side. Leave that end open. Move on to this side. really tall, really skinny. And you reach way back to get that arch. And now we'll add our tall purl. Leave that end open, climb back up this seam, do the other side, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, back, over, bump, bump, go back, go over, bump, bump, back, over, and now add our little purl. Go back up the seam through the stem, and now we just have one more segment to go. This is going to be tough because I have a GoPro. It's kind of ruining my vision, but I'm going to attempt it. Oop, can't see. It's important to see when you're quilting. We'll try to cover that mistake up. Leave a little opening there for our ending purl. And just like the triangle, these feathers sort of climb higher and higher, and then they get smaller and smaller as we lay them down. See how far back I'm reaching? Alright, and then we're going to end in that tall purl. And that's it. And then we can take our eraser pen and we can erase out the purple air erasable pen. And then we are, as soon as I find my scissors, we'll be able to clip this and be done. Maybe you don't own a long arm, and maybe you prefer to sit down when you quilt. Cheryl Dennison will be showing us how to quilt Victorian feathers on a domestic machine. We're moving on to the domestic machine quilting portion of the DVD, and this is Cheryl Dennison. You might recognize her from 11 years ago when she was in the Mastering the Art of McTavishing domestic machine quilting section. She is the greatest domestic machine quilter I know, and I'm more comfortable in a long arm. Not everyone has one, so it's nice to get a domestic machine quilter perspective on why she uses the machine she uses and what you need to have when you're a domestic machine quilter. And Cheryl, tell me a little bit about this modern quilt.
Well, this is something I've made up specifically for this demonstration. I did the straight lines on my Pfaff home domestic machine. So if your domestic machine at home could definitely do these straight lines. This is with the feed dogs up so that your even feed is pulling the quilt through the machine and you get nice straight lines. But now to do the curved quilting of the Victorian feathers, I'm going to move to the George. And I've been practicing on the George. It's got the nice big throat, so I don't have to worry about rolling up my quilt. Generally, we're working on quilts bigger than this, so having the big throat is very important. A couple of the supplies I use, I wear some gloves, so it gives me some friction when I'm holding the quilt down on this table. And let's see, other than that, things are pretty much the same. We're threaded the same, we're using the same kinds of threads. We have a large table that comes with the George. Your home machine probably has an add-on table. Most home machines do.
So Cheryl, anybody can quilt on a small throated machine, is that right?
Yes, anybody can quilt on their home machines. The only thing you have to be really concerned with is rolling up your quilt so that it's fitting through your throat.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much. I'm excited to see the feathers on your modern quilt.
All right. Thanks.
So, a great way to start and this is how I taught Cheryl how to quilt feathers on the domestic machine. We started on paper, we moved to a quilt sandwich with all the markings on it. We had a handout for Cheryl, and now we're ready to move on to her quilt. So Cheryl, how many hours or minutes did you practice?
Oh, well, I took the class from you first, like most people have, to learn the bump, back over process. I went to paper, and if I'm traveling in the car and my husband's driving, I'll just have a notebook and I'll practice. So all in all, I probably spent an hour and a half just doodling, then moving to the fabric. And as you can see, I've done 4 squares. And I've marked it just as you would on a long arm, stitched in the ditch around, so you have your perimeter. And then when you look on the back side, you see that this is what it would look like because you don't have your blue lines. So now I feel that I'm ready to actually work on my real life quilt.
So domestic machine quilting, you're going to need some gloves. Cheryl's got some gloves here, and what she's doing is pointing out the registration lines that she's going to follow to create the flying geese or half square triangle feather. She's going to start by securing her stitch and bringing up her bobbin. Just like on a long arm, we bring up the bobbin every single time. She does a few anchoring stitches, and then she'll be able to start her feathers. So she's gonna grip the quilt between her thumbs, and that's basically drawing with the paper. Long arming, we're drawing with the pencil. It's a totally different feel. See how slow she's going? Long arming, we can go a lot faster to create that curve that we want. So this is the bump, back over method. She's keeping her feathers near the registration line. When you're first starting out as a beginner, you want to make sure that your stitch length isn't an issue. I just want you to work on the control of the feathers, so that bump, back over. You never want to quilt through a feather twice. So it should be a nice clean line like a hand quilter. So she's going bump, and then she's going back with that arc. And those lines are almost on top of each other. And that's the right way to do it. Don't look at your stitch length when you're practicing. Just learning the technique is hard enough. And then later you can master your stitch length. So now she's basically moving those feathers from big to tiny. And she's going to stop in that corner and turn her piece, so it's easier for her to manage the quilt. See how she turns it? And then she'll start, and she'll do it the same way with a little purl in the beginning. So now she's going to make that little purl and do the same thing she just did, except on a second triangle. She'll start off slow with the bump, back over. So she'll make a little purl, and then she'll go over, bump, back, over. And she'll continue on until she's done with the whole block.
And I want to just encourage you to use your domestic machine to do Victorian feathers, and don't be afraid to put Victorian feathers in your modern quilts.
So now we've seen quilting feathers on a domestic sewing machine and a long arm. And I want to give a special thank you to Cheryl Dennison for sharing her beautiful modern quilt with us and showing us how to quilt on a domestic sewing machine. This is the finished quilt section, and I'm going to show you some examples of finished quilts. This is a double batting quilt, modern quilt with some feathers thrown in. I like to throw in feathers on modern quilts once in a while just to show the history of quilting. This next quilt is a Judy Niemeyer pattern, and with paper piecing you see a lot of space between the spikes, and that's when we would lay down our feathers. And I'm not putting a lot of feathers in the actual spikes, just in the background. And I keep them all going either counterclockwise or clockwise. And then the color changes on every single circle. So I like to use matching threads. There was a lot of color changes in this quilt. So I think it highlights the piecing. This is a Halloween Baltimore hand appliqué quilt. And whenever I see plain spaces, I like to do my fanciest quilting. So the border, the two inner borders around the bats, I'd actually drawn on paper first to see how it looked. And then you could light box it right to the quilt and mark it. So the frames around each block, those were pre-marked. The border treatment was pre-marked. And then the background filler was just McTavishing, threw in some spider webs. But the border, I like to use the feathers just to create some movement. This is a double wedding ring, and it was a pattern from So Kinda Wonderful. It was actually a commissioned quilt for a wedding. So we have the border, we have the main block, and then the melons. And the melons in the main block are the same feather motif. The border around the quilt, we used a stencil. And you'll see here how it looks just next to the free motion feathers in the blocks, and then the fuller stencils around the border. And each melon is done the same way, with registration line right through the middle of the melon, and then some simple registration lines in the block. This is Cheryl's quilt, the green quilt. It's very modern. There are no rules with modern quilting, so Cheryl designed this with some minimal feathers. We kind of like to show a little bit of feathering once in a while in a modern quilt, just to show the history of quilting. And you can fit them in between all those straight lines. A lot of the lines were marked so we could follow along and have them truly straight. And then the feathers were free motion machine quilted on a sit-down machine. I think it looks great. This is a student's quilt, Rachel Dorr. She's an amazing machine quilter. She took a few days of private classes in my studio, and her work is pretty amazing. She learned how to add feathers to different shapes, and this is sort of a drunkard's path block, and I thought it was quite beautiful. Here's another Rachel Dorr double wedding ring, and I love this because of the traditional quilting and the non-traditional quilting she did in the quilt. Rachel really had a lot of creative freedom and used modern quilting next to traditional quilting, using the free motion feathers as she saw fit. Basically, she didn't keep a uniformity about it. She just kind of quilted in blocks that felt right. And each arc of the melon, she's added different quilting motifs. You could use high contrasting thread. You could see here with the high contrast. The matching thread right here, you can see you're just seeing the texture. And I love the feathers thrown in, the arcs. This was a rescued quilt from Mary Keir, and she has a book that she's taken vintage quilts and sort of modernized them a bit. This quilt was very old, and it was trapuntoed before the main quilting started, and we were able to play around with free motion machine quilting feathers in the background of all the baskets. And here I'm sort of using my blue pen to pre-mark some of the designs, the stems of the feathers. And you could also see in the black basket that water-soluble thread, and that would be for the trapunto. And here's just some examples of quilting free motion machine feathers in the basket design. Once this quilt was submerged, that water-soluble thread surrounding the basket dissolves, and then the trapunto is held together by all the quilting. So there's some marking pens that I use. The purple air erasable pen, the eraser pen that takes away blue pen and purple pen. And then of course the blue pen I used for the straight lines in the basket. You can see the water-soluble thread there. I'm using a ruler to create straight lines, and that's really when you can see the extra loft of the trapunto. And that eraser pen is taking out the blue lines, and that's a basket with all the markings removed. And we added the the rope to the sashing later. This was another modern quilt, and all the plain fabrics really shows every single stitch in the quilt. Inside of those hexies are the free motion machine quilting feathers. Some of them I've matched my thread color to my fabric, and then because there's no rules in modern quilting, I used high contrasting thread as well in the feathers. And then I matched most of my gray thread in the gray fabric and added a little, they call it a wine glass or an orange peel design. But inside the feathers, you can see that it's all different color changes. This was a really challenging quilt. I had to decide how to quilt it and add feathers, but it was very uneven sashing. So this was a challenge to put in feathers. And so in the sashing area, I added feathers, and they were sort of on a hard angle. And then I just added the long piano keys in the border. The blocks themselves were just stitched in the ditch. And I did color change inside the blocks, and the feathers are just sort of repeating the same thing over and over with like a spiked feather. This is double batting as well. So this was a quilt that it was just two colors, a simple star quilt. And what I did is I broke down the quilt in segments by putting a big X with registration lines and a big plus sign. So the whole thing was pre-marked before it went on my frame. I started in the corners of the borders and just kept adding curls, registration lines in the motifs and inside and outside the star. And then I just took it one half feather at a time. Notice the yellow thread, it was a 60 weight bottom line thread, and it still showed that buildup, which I don't care for a lot of buildup in the stems. But I think it looks really nice, and it's sort of nerve-wracking. This quilt was 100% silk, and it was pretty challenging. We had a beautiful space for quilting. The silk really shows up well when you quilt it. The quilting is just shines through. I had to take the design of the border in, because it was a squared off border, and then the customer of mine, added the edges, and it was piped. This quilt was very heavy. I had to go with the flow of the quilt, so I had to decide in the white area would I do straight lines, and then in the colored silk I was going to do feathers. And like a Delilah, it sort of gives you the impression that the pieces are crossing over one another, so I just kept going in a clockwise direction in the center, using feathers as my main motif. And then the next segment beyond the circle, I just added individual feather motifs, and these are all color changed. So there's several different colors that I needed to quilt this quilt. And I had to watch my needle from breaking because the seams were so thick with that raw silk. So what I ended up doing was quilting these in non-stitch regulated mode so I could power through those seams. This is a Judy Niemeyer quilt, and this is actually Judy's sample. It's all paper pieced. And when I'm quilting a quilt like this, I'm looking for the plain fabrics so I can showcase some really fancy quilting. And in this case, we had that dark navy fabric, and that's where I did a lot of the feathering. I really like this quilt because we have the paper piecing. There's these blue sawtooth right here, and I added the feathers surrounding it in that baby blue thread. I thought it gave it a nice effect, keeping the feathers just a 1/4 inch away from the next color change. So we kept the feathers away from that seam, and I thought that was really pretty. It looked really nice. So this was a great quilt to add feathers to. It was just slightly traditional. We've got the applique in the center. We've got all those on-point designs. And I like to use a pink thread in the pink areas and a yellow thread in the yellow. And then I added the feathers in the border and the center of the applique. So it wasn't like we just put our needle down and go. I drew out stems first so I could follow along in the medallion. You could see on this border, I kind of had a plan for everything with the registration lines. On the blocks that just had the triangles, we just quilted them free motion. This is very similar to the last quilt. We did straight line in the color, and in the gray and light gray, we did the feathers. So you get down to a plan where you're gonna have your feathers going one way on each side. So this is the overall quilt, but you could see that some feathers were going to the left, some feathers were going to the right. And so you had to kind of have a plan and make sure you focused on what was happening. So you didn't have your feathers going the wrong way, just one section at a time. So this was just a really nice plain block quilt. It had a lot of plain borders and a lot of space around the houses. And it's very traditional with the sawtooth border. So I laid it out. I drew about 1/4 of the design out on paper, and then I light boxed it, and you'll see the feathers that were pretty elaborate. So it took a little bit of time, but the border treatment was just drawn out all on paper first so I could get the mirror image of it on the other side of the quilt, and I just flipped the design. This quilt was memorable because it was trapuntoed, and it took me quite some time to finish. I want to say that it may have taken me 3 to 4 weeks. Just the trapunto trimming alone took a long time. You got to be very careful to, not snip the quilt top. All the designs were hand drawn around the border. I had a plan for everything before it was quilted, and the loft really is gorgeous in the applique. This is a quilt I love because it was the aged muslin, and I love that fabric. This is a simple 9-patch, and it's a perfect example on how to do freehand Victorian feathers, where you're just simply dropping your needle down, maybe draw out some registration line scrolls, and then you just follow the feathering design. I love doing feathers this way. It's very zen. The trick is to have all the registration lines marked on. This is a embroidered quilt by Marge West. And everything was pre-drawn, so I drew on the quilt before we started quilting it. It wasn't that big of a quilt. I think it was in the 60 by 60 range. All the stencil work was done and the marking of the frames before it went on the Longarm. So we had a plan. We knew exactly what we were gonna do. I used a lot of purple marking pen to do those curved cross hatchings. Sometimes people just drop down the ruler, and I tend to just mark everything. This is a quilt that was done by Victoria Finley Wolf, and I had a great time with the feathering inside this. It's like this sphere, and it's an optical illusion. What I kind of use this fractal design I saw on the internet for the outside border treatment. I actually projected onto the quilt directly with the projector, and then I added the really flared out feathers in the melon area and the blocks. And there's lots of McTavishing in between all those squares. And those registration lines were drawn on before I started quilting. It's really fun to stretch out feathers. Here's another embroidered quilt. The background, I just didn't want to do any kind of filler. I just wanted to fill the whole thing up with feathers. So this is actually a pretty big quilt with a big center medallion. And so anytime you see a busy fabric, I just use piano keys. And this is also silk. And when you have a silk fabric, it really shows how amazing your quilting, like it will just show up so well. So here's the middle of the medallion with a big feather design. And that was all done using that was done using a marking tool that we draw on the stem and then follow it with freehand quilting. And then we did the same in the blocks, just a little on a smaller scale. And again, we have the diagonal lines. I think it's a nice juxtaposition of having the freehand feathers next to straight lines. And then it's got the little rope and the sashing. Thank you for watching, and also a special thanks to all the quilters who gave me permission to share their work with you. To learn more advanced quilting skills, go to my website at www.mctavishquilting.com.